Your cockatoo is showing you something right now, today, probably in the last hour. A behavior you've seen so many times that it doesn't even register anymore. You've given it a name. Maybe you call it their quirk. Maybe you call it attention-seeking. Maybe you call it just being a cockatoo. And that name you gave it is wrong. Not slightly wrong, inverted. The exact opposite of what's actually happening inside your bird. There are 3 specific body language signals that cockatoo owners witness every single day and misread every single time. And the distance between what the owner sees and what the cockatoo is actually communicating is where screaming starts, where plucking starts, where a behavioral problem grows in silence for months before it detonates into something the owner swears came out of nowhere. It didn't come out of nowhere. It came from a signal that was there the entire time, wearing a mask you never thought to look behind. 3 signals, 3 masks. And once I pull them off, you will never look at your cockatoo the same way again. Because the difference between a bird that is asking for attention and a bird that is drowning in stress looks almost identical from the outside. Almost. And that almost is everything. Subscribe if you'd rather catch it early than fix it late. The first mask is the one your cockatoo wears every single day. And you've been rewarding it. The bird you think wants attention. They pace along the front of the cage when you walk past. They bob their head. They vocalize, not screaming, not alarm calling, a persistent, mid-volume chatter directed at you every time you're in sight. They hang from the cage bars. They flap. They do everything in their physical vocabulary to pull your eyes toward them. And you've decided this is attention-seeking. You respond sometimes, ignore it other times. Maybe you've even been told by a trainer or a forum that acknowledging this behavior reinforces it. So you walk past, avert your eyes, and wait for them to settle. Here's what's actually happening inside that cage. Your cockatoo is not performing for your attention. They are signaling displacement behavior, a category of action that occurs when an animal's psychological needs are unmet and the stress of that unmet need has to go somewhere physical. The pacing isn't excitement. It's a motor pattern driven by cortisol. The bar hanging isn't playful. It's a redirected need for locomotion in a body that was designed to fly miles per day and is confined to 4 square feet. The persistent vocalization isn't chatty personality. It is a stress call wearing a social mask, calibrated just below the volume that would alarm you, just above the silence that means they've given up. The difference between genuine attention-seeking and stress displacement signaling lives in one detail most owners never check. What happens after you give the attention? A bird that genuinely wanted interaction will settle. The behavior resolves. The need was met. A bird in stress displacement will escalate after receiving attention or briefly pause and restart within minutes because the attention was never what they needed. The underlying stressor, insufficient space, inadequate foraging, lack of flight opportunity, environmental unpredictability remains. And the displacement behavior cycles back the moment the momentary distraction of your presence fades. You haven't been watching an attention-seeking bird. You've been watching a stressed bird use the only language it has to tell you that something in their daily life isn't working. And every time you ignored it because someone told you not to reinforce it, you taught your cockatoo that their stress report gets filed and no one reads it. That doesn't create a calmer bird. It creates a bird that escalates to the next available tool, which is the scream you're now trying to fix. The scream didn't come out of nowhere. It was a promotion. The mid-volume signal you ignored got loud because quiet wasn't working. The behavior you think is personality. This one is going to be harder to hear because you might love this behavior. You might have filmed it. You might have shown it to friends and said, "Look at this weird thing my cockatoo does," and everyone laughed and you thought it was personality. Watch for this, a repetitive behavior that follows the same motor pattern every time it occurs. Maybe they trace the same route along the top of the cage, back and forth, identical path, identical turns. Maybe they bob their head in a rhythmic loop that repeats without variation for minutes at a time, even when nothing in the environment is stimulating it. Maybe they chew a specific cage bar, always the same bar, always the same spot, not to escape, not with apparent purpose, just a mechanical, repetitive grinding that has become part of the background noise of your home. These are not quirks. These are stereotypies. Repetitive, functionless motor patterns that develop in captive animals when their psychological environment fails to meet the complexity their brain requires. They are the pharaoh, the avian equivalent of a person pacing a cell. They emerge slowly. They start small, a slight repetition you barely notice. And they calcify over weeks and months into fixed behavioral loops that the cockatoo performs involuntarily, sometimes for hours, with a glazed, disconnected look in their eyes that should alarm you far more than any scream ever has. Because a screaming cockatoo is a cockatoo that's still fighting. They still believe communication might work. They still have the emotional energy to demand something from their environment. A cockatoo performing stereotypies has crossed a line that is much harder to come back from. Their brain has begun self-generating stimulation because the external world stopped providing it. The loop isn't something they choose. It's something their nervous system built to survive the gap between what their brain needs and what their life contains. If you see a repetitive behavior that follows the exact same pattern every time, that persists even when you're interacting with them, that has a mechanical quality that lacks the variability of normal play or exploration, that is not your cockatoo's personality. That is your cockatoo's brain sending you an emergency signal wrapped in a behavior so quiet you never thought to question it. The fix isn't punishment, it isn't interruption. It's complexity, novel foraging challenges daily, destructible materials rotated constantly, environmental variety, moving the cage, rearranging perches, introducing new textures, new sounds, new sightlines. A brain that is busy processing a rich, unpredictable environment cannot simultaneously maintain a stereotypic loop. The loop starves when the world becomes interesting enough to replace it. But you have to catch it early, because a stereotypy that has been running for months becomes neurologically entrenched, etched into the motor pathways like a groove worn into wood. The longer it runs, the harder it is to overwrite. And it always starts small. It always looks like nothing. It always looks like personality. The silence you were grateful for, this is the one that will sit in your chest for a while after you hear it. Because this is the signal you were thankful for. Your cockatoo used to be loud, used to pace, used to call and chatter and hang from the bars and make themselves impossible to ignore. And then one day, gradually, over weeks maybe, they stopped. They got quieter, calmer. They sat on their perch and didn't fuss. They stopped calling when you left the room. They stopped pacing when you walked past, and you exhaled. Finally, they've adjusted, they've matured, they're content, they're fine. They are not fine. What you are looking at, what you have been gratefully interpreting as peace, may be learned helplessness. A psychological state documented across species in which an animal that has repeatedly communicated a need and received no effective response eventually stops communicating entirely. Not because the need resolved, because the animal learned that expressing it produces nothing. The cockatoo didn't become calm. They gave up. The pacing stopped because the pacing never changed anything. The calling stopped because the calling was never answered in a way that addressed what was actually wrong. The bar chewing stopped because the bar chewing didn't open the door. One by one, every behavior in their repertoire was deployed and failed and was retired. And what's left isn't serenity. It's a cockatoo sitting on a perch with a cortisol level you cannot see, a hormonal baseline quietly deteriorating, a feather quality slowly declining, and an emotional interior that has withdrawn from the world because the world proved it wasn't listening. This is the stage that precedes plucking, not the screaming stage, not the pacing stage. This stage, the quiet one, the one that looks like progress. Feather-destructive behavior in cockatoos almost never begins during the loud phase. It begins after the loud phase fails. When every external signal has been exhausted, the stress turns inward, and the first feather pulled is not a new problem. It's the final chapter of a story that started with a signal you called attention-seeking and ends with a bird dismantling themselves in silence, because they ran out of ways to ask for help that you could hear. If your cockatoo went quiet and you felt relief, go look at them right now. Not at what they're doing, at what they stopped doing, at the behaviors that vanished that you never questioned because their absence made your life easier. Are they still calling when you leave? Still pacing when they need something? Still making themselves loud and inconvenient and impossible to ignore? Good. That noise means the line is still open. That noise means they still believe that communicating with you works. The day the noise stops without explanation is not the day your cockatoo found peace. It's the day the signal went dark, and the window between that silence and the first pulled feather is shorter than you want to believe. 3 signals, 3 masks. The attention seeker who was actually stressed. The quirky bird who was actually compulsive. The calm bird who had actually given up. You've been looking at all 3 and seeing what you wanted to see, or what someone told you to see, instead of what was actually there. That changes now, not because you failed before, because no one ever taught you what these signals look like when they're telling the truth instead of wearing a name that made them easier to live with. Your cockatoo's body has been speaking clearly this entire time. Every behavior was a sentence, every pattern was a paragraph. And the full story, the one that leads to crisis or the one that leads to intervention, depends entirely on whether the person reading it knows the difference between the mask and what's underneath. Like if you're going to look at your cockatoo differently after this, and subscribe because their body never stops talking and you're just getting fluent.